The people who think you'll never leave are usually the ones least prepared for the day you do. The words would echo through Daniel Whitmore's mind months later. But on that warm Friday evening, standing beneath the golden glow of imported crystal chandeliers, he felt untouchable. Laughter drifted across the sprawling backyard of his lakefront home outside Charlotte, North Carolina. The smell of grilled steaks lingered in the humid summer air while guests gathered around polished stone fire pits overlooking the dark water. Daniel stood at the center of it all, a glass of sparkling water in one hand, surrounded by business partners and longtime friends who admired the life he had built. At least that was what everyone believed. Across the patio, Ava Whitmore stood quietly near the sliding glass doors, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug that had long gone cold. At 39 years old, Ava carried herself with the calm dignity of someone who had spent years putting everyone else first. Her dark curls rested softly against her shoulders. The porch light reflected in her eyes, but there was something different there tonight. Something distant. Something tired. Daniel barely noticed. For years, he had grown comfortable with her presence the same way people grow comfortable with the walls of their home. Always there. Always dependable. Almost invisible. "Come on," one of his friends joked. "Tell us what happened." Daniel smirked. Nothing happened. A few chuckles followed. "Then why does Ava look like she's ready to move out?" another friend asked. The group laughed. Daniel glanced toward the house. Ava met his eyes for only a second before looking away. Instead of concern, amusement crossed his face. "Trust me," he said confidently. "She's not going anywhere." More laughter. Someone raised an eyebrow. "You sound pretty sure." Daniel took a slow sip. 17 years. "She always stays." The words landed heavier than he intended. Ava heard every one of them. The mug in her hands remained perfectly still. Inside the house, beyond the music and conversation, a small black suitcase sat beside the staircase. Packed. Ready. Waiting. Daniel didn't know that. Nobody did. The evening continued as if nothing had changed. Guests exchanged stories. Glasses clinked. The lake reflected streaks of orange and purple from the setting sun. Yet beneath the surface, something had already shifted. Ava stepped inside quietly. No dramatic scene. No tears. No argument. The familiar hardwood floors creaked beneath her feet as she walked through the home she had spent nearly 2 decades turning into a family. Every photograph on the walls carried a memory. Birthdays, vacations, holidays, milestones, moments she had carefully preserved while Daniel chased success. She paused beside a framed picture of their daughter Emma at age 10, smiling with missing front teeth and holding a science fair ribbon. Ava's fingertips brushed the edge of the frame. Her chest tightened, but her expression remained calm. Upstairs, the bedroom felt strangely empty. The evening light spilled across the neatly folded blanket at the foot of the bed. On the dresser sat her wedding ring. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she gently placed a handwritten envelope beside it. Nothing more. No speech. No confrontation. Just a single letter. Downstairs, the party was winding down. Daniel walked toward the kitchen, still smiling from a conversation about a new business deal. He reached for the refrigerator, expecting to find Ava organizing leftovers or preparing coffee for tomorrow morning like she always did. Instead, the room was silent. He frowned slightly. "Ava." No answer. Outside, a rideshare vehicle pulled away from the curb. Ava sat in the back seat without looking behind her. The lake disappeared from view as the car turned onto the highway. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. Back inside the house, Daniel finally noticed the suitcase was gone. Then he saw the envelope. And for the first time that evening, something inside him felt unexpectedly cold. A person can disappear long before they ever walk away, and Ava Whitmore had been disappearing for years. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the empty side of the king-sized bed in Daniel's house. But Ava was already 200 miles away. Daniel sat at the edge of the mattress, holding the letter she had left behind. He had read it 3 times before leaving for work, yet somehow he still believed she would call before lunch. She always did. What Daniel did not understand was that the woman who left had spent nearly 17 years giving away pieces of herself, one quiet sacrifice at a time. Long before Daniel became the respected executive everyone admired, Ava had been the one balancing impossible schedules at the kitchen table while their daughter slept upstairs. She remembered nights when bills covered every inch of the dining room table, and Daniel doubted whether his small construction company would survive another month. While he met investors and chased contracts, Ava worked late shifts, managed household expenses, and somehow kept fear from entering their home. Nobody applauded those moments because nobody saw them. As the years passed, Daniel's business grew. The modest two-bedroom house became a lakeside property. The old pickup truck became luxury SUVs. Their vacations became more expensive. Their social circle changed. But something else changed too. The more successful Daniel became, the less people seemed to notice the woman standing beside him. At charity galas, guests congratulated Daniel on his achievements while Ava smiled politely from a few steps away. At business dinners, people remembered Daniel's speeches, but forgot Ava had organized half the events. Even family members slowly accepted a version of reality where Daniel was the builder and Ava was simply fortunate to be there. Ava never corrected them. She was not the type of woman who demanded recognition. She found purpose in helping others succeed. Yet every year, another dream quietly slipped away. Before marriage, Ava had wanted to open a community learning center for underprivileged children. She had notebooks filled with plans, budgets, and ideas. Those notebooks remained stored in a cardboard box in the attic. There was never enough time. Emma needed rides to school. Daniel needed support during expansion projects. Aging relatives needed care. Life kept asking Ava to wait until later. Later eventually became 17 years. One rainy afternoon years. Earlier, Emma had come home from school carrying a family assignment. The teacher asked students to write about the hero they admired most. Daniel remembered expecting his name. After all, he had built a successful company from nothing. Instead, 10-year-old Emma wrote 5 pages about her mother. Ava still kept the paper folded inside a kitchen drawer. Emma had written, "My mom makes everyone feel safe. She remembers things nobody else remembers. She knows when people are sad before they say anything. She fixes problems without telling anyone she fixed them." Daniel had read it once and laughed. He called it sweet. Then he forgot about it. Ava never did. Because deep down, those words were the closest anyone had come to truly seeing her. Now, sitting alone in a quiet apartment outside Charleston, South Carolina, Ava unpacked a small collection of clothes into white wooden drawers. The apartment was simple. No lake views. No marble countertops. No grand entrance. Just sunlight, clean walls, and silence. She opened a window overlooking a narrow street lined with oak trees. A warm coastal breeze drifted through the room, carrying the faint scent of salt water. For the first time in years, there was nobody waiting for her to solve a problem. Nobody expecting her to carry the emotional weight of an entire household. Ava stood there for a long moment listening to the wind move through the branches. The silence felt unfamiliar. It also felt like freedom. Back in North Carolina, Daniel walked into his office expecting another ordinary Monday. He still believed Ava simply needed time. He still believed she would eventually return. What he did not realize was that the woman everyone overlooked had been holding together far more than a marriage. And without her, cracks were already beginning to form where nobody expected them. For the first few days, Daniel Whitmore treated Ava's departure like a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent decision. He told himself she simply needed space. He told his coworkers she was visiting friends. He even convinced himself that everything would return to normal before the end of the month. That belief allowed him to continue, moving through life with the same confidence that had carried him for years. On Thursday evening, less than a week after Ava left, Daniel hosted a dinner at an upscale steakhouse in downtown Charlotte. The restaurant overlooked the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the atmosphere buzzed with quiet conversations and the soft clinking of glasses. Daniel sat at the center of a table filled with business associates. He laughed at jokes, discussed upcoming projects, and spoke enthusiastically about future expansion plans. From the outside, he looked exactly the same. Successful, composed, in control. Yet several times throughout the evening, his hand drifted toward his phone. No messages from Ava. No missed calls. Nothing. The silence annoyed him more than he cared to admit. Across town, Ava was arranging books on a small wooden shelf in her apartment. A second-hand lamp cast a warm glow across the room, while a soft jazz station played from an old radio she found at a local market. She moved slowly, taking her time. There was no rush anymore. No schedule to coordinate. No dinner party to prepare. No crisis waiting around the corner. Every object she unpacked seemed to return a small piece of herself she had forgotten existed. Meanwhile, Daniel continued celebrating what he believed was freedom. Over the weekend, he accepted invitations he normally declined. Golf outings, networking events, private dinners. Friends praised him for staying positive during what they assumed was a temporary separation. One man even joked that Daniel was finally enjoying bachelor life again. Daniel laughed along with everyone else. Yet each night he returned to a house that felt strangely different. Not empty exactly, just unfamiliar. The first sign appeared Monday morning. Daniel woke late because nobody reminded him about an early conference call. By the time he reached the office, he had already missed 2 important messages. His assistant seemed surprised. Normally, Daniel never forgot appointments. Later that afternoon, he arrived at a meeting without documents he needed for a presentation. The oversight was minor, but unusual. Daniel blamed exhaustion. The next day brought another small disruption. Then another. Tiny inconveniences accumulated like cracks forming beneath fresh paint. A client called asking about details from a previous conversation. Daniel could not find the notes. Another partner referenced a family event Daniel had apparently agreed to attend months earlier. He had forgotten entirely. For years, those details had somehow remained organized. Birthdays, appointments, commitments, important reminders. Daniel never stopped to wonder how. At home, the changes became harder to ignore. The refrigerator contained expensive groceries, but no actual meals. Laundry piled up faster than expected. Mail covered the kitchen counter. Plants near the windows slowly began to droop. The housekeeper still cleaned every week, yet the home somehow felt less cared for, less alive. One evening, Daniel opened the pantry searching for coffee and discovered labeled containers arranged with impossible precision. Rice, pasta, flour, emergency supplies. Each label was written in Ava's neat handwriting. He stared at them longer than necessary before closing the cabinet. The following Friday, Daniel attended a fundraising banquet where he expected to see many familiar faces. As he moved through the crowd, something unexpected happened. Several people asked about Ava before asking about him. One woman from a local charity smiled politely and said, "Please tell Ava we miss her planning committee meetings." Another guest mentioned how much easier community events had been when Ava was involved. Daniel forced a smile every time. Yet with each conversation, an uncomfortable realization began forming at the edge of his thoughts. People remembered Ava, more than he realized, more than he ever acknowledged. Late that night, Daniel returned home alone. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the lake. He loosened his tie and walked through the dark kitchen. The house seemed larger than usual, colder somehow. His eyes settled on an empty chair at the dining table. Ava's chair. For years it had always been occupied. Tonight it sat motionless beneath the dim overhead light. Daniel looked away almost immediately, but the image stayed with him. And for the first time since she left, a question entered his mind that he could not easily dismiss. What if Ava was not planning to come back at all? The first real crack appeared 3 weeks after Ava left. It arrived quietly on a Tuesday morning inside a conference room overlooking downtown Charlotte. Daniel sat across from representatives of a development firm that had worked with Whitmore Construction for nearly a decade. Normally, meetings like this ended with handshakes and signed agreements. Instead, the atmosphere felt strangely tense. Halfway through the presentation, one of the executives cleared his throat and asked a simple question. Did Ava review these community partnership details? Daniel frowned. Why would she? The executive exchanged a glance with his colleague. Because she always did. The room fell silent for a moment. Daniel quickly redirected the conversation, but the exchange lingered in his mind long after the meeting ended. Later that afternoon, another surprise arrived. A local nonprofit withdrew from a joint project his company had sponsored for years. The director's email was polite but direct. She explained that Ava had been the person who coordinated volunteers, solved scheduling conflicts, and maintained relationships with community leaders. Without her involvement, they preferred to pause future collaboration. Daniel stared at the screen longer than necessary. He had attended every public event. His name appeared on every donation plaque. Yet somehow Ava had been the person holding everything together behind the scenes. The realization unsettled him. That evening, rain clouds gathered over the lake as Daniel drove home through heavy traffic. His phone buzzed with a message from Emma. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. Finally, their daughter had been distant since Ava left. He opened the message immediately. It contained only one sentence. "Dad, did you ever actually listen to Mom?" Daniel read it twice. Then a third time. He typed several responses before deleting them all. Across the state line in South Carolina, Ava was experiencing a very different evening. She sat on a small balcony outside her apartment, wrapped in a light sweater as the ocean breeze drifted inland. A notebook rested in her lap. For the first time in years, she was writing again. Ideas filled page after page. Community education programs, youth mentorship plans, scholarship workshops. Dreams she had postponed for nearly 2 decades slowly returned to life. Every few minutes, she would pause and look toward the fading sunset. There was sadness, certainly. 17 years could not simply disappear. But beneath the sadness lived something stronger. Hope. Back in North Carolina, Daniel wandered through his house, unable to focus. The rooms felt unusually large. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the hallway clock, the distant rain tapping against glass. He eventually found himself standing in the attic. He had not entered the space in years. Dust floated through narrow beams of light, filtering from a small window near the roof. Boxes lined the walls. Holiday decorations. Old toys. Forgotten storage containers. As he searched for nothing in particular, his eyes landed on a worn cardboard box labeled simply Projects. Curiosity made him open it. Inside were dozens of notebooks. Carefully organized. Carefully preserved. Daniel pulled one free and opened it. Page after page revealed detailed plans for community learning centers, mentorship programs, literacy initiatives, and educational outreach projects. Budgets. Research. Timelines. Grant proposals. The work was impressive, professional, ambitious, and every page carried Ava's handwriting. Daniel slowly sat down on an old wooden chair nearby. Outside, thunder rolled across the darkening sky. He turned another page, then another. The notebooks continued for years. Hundreds of hours. Thousands of ideas. Dreams postponed. Opportunities sacrificed. Entire chapters of Ava's life he had never bothered to ask about. For the first time since she left, Daniel no longer felt annoyed or inconvenienced. He felt something far more uncomfortable. He was beginning to understand how much of Ava's life had quietly disappeared while everyone, including him, celebrated his success. The weeks that followed felt less like a crisis, and more like a slow unraveling. Nothing collapsed overnight. That was what made it so difficult for Daniel to recognize. Problems arrived one at a time, disguised as ordinary inconveniences. A trusted project manager resigned unexpectedly after accepting an offer from a competitor. A longtime client delayed a contract renewal. 2 community partnerships quietly expired. None of those setbacks would have been devastating on their own, yet together they created a pressure Daniel had not experienced in years. One cold October morning, he arrived at the office before sunrise, hoping to regain control of the growing chaos. The city skyline glowed pale blue beyond the windows while traffic lights flickered below like distant embers. Daniel sat alone at the conference table reviewing reports. Numbers that once looked strong now seemed less stable. Deadlines were slipping. Relationships were weakening. For the first time in his career, he felt exhausted before the day even began. Around noon, his phone rang. It was his mother. Relief briefly crossed his face. He had not spoken with her in weeks. "Mom," he answered. "How are you?" There was a pause. "I am fine," she replied gently. "I was calling to check on Ava." The question hit harder than he expected. "You called to check on Ava?" Another pause. "Daniel, your wife spent years making sure everyone in this family stayed connected. Birthdays, holidays, hospital visits, Sunday dinners. Since she left, nobody knows what is happening anymore." He looked down at the polished conference table. His mother continued softly. "I think we all depended on her more than we realized." After the call ended, Daniel remained seated for several minutes. Outside his office, employees moved through hallways carrying coffee cups and laptops. Inside, silence pressed heavily against him. That evening, he stopped by Emma's apartment without warning. His daughter opened the door and seemed genuinely surprised to see him. The awkwardness between them felt unfamiliar. Emma invited him inside, but the warmth that once existed between father and daughter was missing. They sat across from one another at a small kitchen table. Daniel searched for the right words. Have you talked to your mother? Emma nodded. A few times. Is she doing okay? Emma smiled faintly. Better than okay. Something about that answer unsettled him. What does that mean? Emma leaned back in her chair. It means she smiles now. Daniel frowned. She smiled before. Emma looked at him carefully. Not angry. Not accusing. Just honest. Not like this, Dad. The conversation ended shortly afterward, but Emma's words followed him all the way home. Not like this. That night, rain drifted across the lake in soft silver streaks. Daniel stood alone in the kitchen holding a coffee mug he had found in the back of a cabinet. It belonged to Ava. The ceramic was chipped near the handle. Most people would have thrown it away years ago. Ava never did. She said some things deserved to stay even after they became imperfect. The memory arrived unexpectedly and left him staring into the darkness beyond the window. His eyes drifted toward the dining room. The same empty chair remained tucked neatly beneath the table. The same silence filled the house. The same absence waited in every room. Weeks earlier, he had believed Ava would return. Then he convinced himself he simply missed having help. Now, standing in the quiet house she once filled with life, Daniel finally confronted a truth he had spent months avoiding. The problem was not that his routines had changed. The problem was that the person he loved had been carrying his world for years while he took her presence for granted. And now that she was gone, he could finally see the weight she had been carrying alone. A month later, the first cool winds of November drifted through Charleston, carrying the scent of salt water and distant rain. Ava stood outside a renovated brick community center near the waterfront, her hands tucked into the pockets of a light tin coat. The morning sun painted the old building in shades of gold, and for a moment, she simply stood there listening. Children laughed somewhere inside. A delivery truck rumbled past on the street. Seagulls circled above the harbor. The sounds felt ordinary, yet to Ava they sounded like the beginning of a life she had almost forgotten she wanted. 3 weeks earlier, she had volunteered to help organize a weekend literacy workshop. Then another. Then another. Word spread quickly. Parents appreciated her patience. Teachers admired her organization. Community leaders noticed her ability to solve problems without seeking attention. The same gifts she had quietly given away for years were finally being used for something that belonged to her. Inside the center, folding chairs lined a bright classroom. Whiteboards covered the walls. Colorful books filled newly assembled shelves. Ava moved between rooms checking schedules, greeting volunteers, and helping children find their seats. Every time someone thanked her, she smiled politely, still unaccustomed to being seen. Around noon, the director approached carrying a clipboard. "You know," she said, "I still cannot believe this entire mentorship program was your idea." Ava laughed softly. "It was an old idea. Then I am glad you finally brought it to life." The words stayed with her for the rest of the day. An old idea. Years ago, those dreams had lived only inside notebooks hidden in an attic. Now they were becoming real. That evening, Ava returned to her apartment exhausted but content. The setting sun filled the living room with warm amber light. A stack of program applications rested on her coffee table beside a half-finished cup of tea. She kicked off her shoes and settled into a chair near the window. For a long time, she simply sat there watching leaves drift across the sidewalk below. The peace felt unfamiliar at first. Not because her life lacked challenges. There was still uncertainty, still healing, still moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly. But the constant pressure she had carried for years was gone. She no longer woke each morning wondering how to keep everyone else's world from falling apart. Across the state line, Daniel's evenings looked very different. He spent longer hours at the office. The house remained quiet. Even the lake seemed different now. The water that once reflected celebrations and family gatherings now reflected only empty rooms and dark windows. Yet tonight, Ava did not think about any of that. She reached for a notebook resting beside her chair and opened it to a fresh page. New plans filled her mind. Scholarship partnerships, evening tutoring sessions, career workshops for single parents. Opportunity no longer felt distant. It felt possible. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping softly against the glass. Ava smiled and wrapped both hands around her tea. The apartment glowed with warmth. A small lamp illuminated the room. Books filled the shelves she had assembled herself. A framed photograph of Emma sat near the window. Nothing about the space was extravagant, yet it felt more like home than the mansion she had left behind. For years, she believed strength meant enduring, carrying burdens, staying no matter how invisible she felt. Now she was learning something different. Sometimes strength meant walking away from a place where your value was ignored. Sometimes strength meant choosing yourself before there was nothing left of yourself to choose. Ava looked out at the rain-covered street below and felt a quiet certainty settle into her heart. Whatever happened next, she was no longer waiting for permission to live the life she wanted. She had already begun. By early December, the distance between Daniel's old life and his new reality could no longer be ignored. The holiday season had always transformed the Whitmore house into a place filled with warmth. Ava had been the one who remembered every tradition. She knew which ornaments belonged on which branches. She knew which neighbors received homemade gift baskets. She knew which relatives preferred phone calls instead of cards. This year, the house remained mostly dark. A single wreath hung on the front door, placed there by a landscaping company. It looked perfect. It also felt completely empty. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel found himself wandering through rooms that seemed larger every week. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the lake. Inside, silence followed him from room to room. Eventually, he climbed back into the attic. He told himself he was looking for holiday decorations. Instead, he found another box. This one was smaller than the others. A faded label on the side simply read letters. Curious, he carried it downstairs and placed it on the dining room table. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight as he lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of sealed envelopes arranged in careful stacks. Each one was addressed to him. None had ever been mailed. Daniel opened the first letter with trembling fingers. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. The date in the corner was nearly 12 years old. He began reading. Ava wrote about feeling lonely during the years he spent traveling for work. She described sitting awake at night waiting for phone calls that never came. Yet there was no bitterness in her words, only honesty. The second letter came from 8 years earlier. Ava wrote about canceling a certification program she wanted to complete because Emma needed extra support during a difficult school year. She never mentioned sacrifice. She simply explained her decision and hoped one day he would understand. The third letter was harder to read. She described attending a charity event where people praised Daniel's accomplishments for hours without once acknowledging the work she had contributed behind the scenes. She wrote that she was proud of him. She also admitted she sometimes wondered whether anyone truly saw her anymore. Daniel lowered the paper slowly. The room blurred. Outside, winter rain tapped softly against the windows. He opened another letter. Then another. Then another. Years unfolded across those pages. Missed conversations. Deferred dreams. Quiet disappointments. Small acts of love. Small acts of forgiveness. Again and again, Ava chose understanding when resentment would have been easier. She chose patience when she felt overlooked. She chose support even when nobody thanked her. The realization struck him with painful clarity. Ava had not left because of one argument. She had not left because of one bad year. She had been slowly disappearing inside the marriage while convincing herself everything was fine. And he had never noticed. Hours passed. Darkness settled outside. The dining room remained illuminated by a single lamp above the table. Empty coffee cups surrounded him. Open letters covered every available surface. Daniel sat motionless in the middle of it all. For the first time in his life, he was seeing his marriage through Ava's eyes. The experience was devastating. Not because she accused him of cruelty. She never did. What hurt most was discovering how often she had reached for connection while he remained distracted by everything else. Later that evening, his phone rang. It was Emma. He answered immediately. "Dad?" she asked softly. "Are you okay?" Daniel looked down at the letters scattered across the table. His voice cracked slightly before he answered. "I do not think I ever knew how much your mother gave up." Silence lingered on the line. Then Emma spoke quietly. Neither did she. Not until she finally stopped giving it away. Daniel closed his eyes. Outside, the rain continued falling across the dark lake. Inside, surrounded by the written record of a life he had taken for granted, he finally understood the truth. He had spent years believing Ava needed him more than he needed her. The letters proved exactly the opposite. 3 days before Christmas, Daniel made a decision that would have terrified the version of himself who existed a year earlier. He stopped trying to control the outcome. For months he had searched for explanations, for strategies, for ways to fix what had broken. Yet every honest reflection led him to the same conclusion. Ava was not a problem to solve. She was a person he had failed to appreciate. Early that morning, he left North Carolina and drove south toward Charleston. The winter sky hung low and silver above the highway. Bare trees lined the road. Traffic moved steadily beneath a cold wind that rattled against his windows. In the passenger seat rested a small leather folder. There were no legal documents inside, no financial offers, no grand gestures, only a handwritten letter. By the time he reached Charleston, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. The city glowed with soft golden light. Historic brick buildings cast long shadows across narrow streets decorated with holiday wreaths and white lights. Daniel parked several blocks from the community center where Ava spent much of her time. He sat in the car for several minutes, staring through the windshield while his heartbeat echoed in his ears. Then he stepped outside. The center was alive with activity. Families entered carrying donations. Volunteers arranged supplies for a holiday event. Children's laughter drifted through open doors. Daniel immediately saw Ava. She stood near the entrance speaking with a group of parents. Her face looked different somehow. Not younger, not older, lighter. The constant weight she once carried was gone. For a moment he simply watched. Then she turned and saw him. The world seemed to pause. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Finally, Ava walked toward him. Her expression remained calm. Not angry. Not cold. Just careful. They stood facing one another beneath strings of white holiday lights. Daniel realized he had imagined this moment hundreds of times. Every speech he rehearsed suddenly disappeared. "Hello, Ava," he said quietly. "Hello, Daniel." A long silence followed. Wind stirred the branches overhead. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang the hour. Daniel looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I owe you an apology." Ava said nothing. She simply listened. Daniel continued. "Not for one argument. Not for one mistake. For years." His voice remained steady, but emotion sat beneath every word. "I thought being a good provider was enough. I thought success made everything else less important. I thought you would always be there." Ava lowered her gaze for a moment. "I was there," she answered softly. "That was the problem." The honesty of the statement landed gently, yet it carried the weight of 17 years. Daniel nodded. "I know that now." He handed her the leather folder. "This is not a request. It is not an excuse. I just wanted you to have it." Ava accepted the folder, but did not open it. Around them, volunteers continued preparing for the evening event. Life moved forward. Neither of them seemed in a hurry. "I read the letters," Daniel said. Ava looked surprised. "All of them. Every one." The corners of her eyes softened. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I finally understand how much of yourself you gave away." Another silence settled between them. This one felt different. Less painful. More honest. "And what happens now?" Ava asked. Daniel glanced toward the community center where families gathered beneath warm lights and holiday decorations. Then he looked back at her. "For the first time in my life, I do not think I get to decide that." Ava studied him carefully. The old Daniel would have arrived with promises, solutions, and expectations. The man standing before her now seemed smaller somehow. Not weaker, simply humbled. The winter wind carried the scent of the nearby harbor. Holiday music drifted faintly from inside the building. For the first time since she left, neither of them seemed trapped inside the past. They simply stood together beneath the fading evening sky, facing a future neither could predict. The week after Christmas arrived quietly. No dramatic announcements. No sudden reconciliation. No grand ending worthy of a headline. Life simply continued, one day at a time. Yet something had changed. Daniel returned to North Carolina carrying no promises and no expectations. For the first time in many years, he stopped measuring progress by results. He focused instead on becoming the kind of man who would have noticed Ava long before she felt invisible. The lake house remained large and quiet, but it no longer felt like a monument to success. It felt like a place filled with lessons. Some evenings Daniel sat at the dining room table reading through the letters again. Not because he enjoyed the pain they caused, but because they reminded him of truths he never wanted to forget. He began calling family members more often. He attended community events without expecting recognition. He listened more than he spoke. The changes were small, almost invisible, yet they were real. Several months later, spring arrived along the Carolina coast. Warm sunlight spilled across Charleston streets lined with blooming trees. The community center Ava helped build had become one of the most respected programs in the area. Children filled classrooms after school. Parents attended workshops. Volunteers continued joining every month. One Saturday afternoon, Ava stood near the entrance watching a group of students present projects they had worked on for weeks. Their excitement filled the room. Their confidence reminded her why she started. Nearby, Emma laughed while helping organize refreshments. The sight brought a smile to Ava's face. Her life was not perfect. Some scars remained. Some questions had no simple answers. Yet she felt whole in a way she had not felt for years. As the event ended, Ava stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The harbor shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Behind her, the center buzzed with life. Ahead of her stretched a future she had chosen for herself. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Beautiful day. Ava turned. Daniel stood several feet away holding 2 cups of coffee. Not because he expected anything. Not because he assumed he belonged there. Simply because he remembered she liked coffee on cool afternoons near the water. He offered 1 cup. Ava accepted it. Neither rushed to fill the silence. The harbor breeze carried the scent of salt and spring flowers. Somewhere nearby, a bell rang from a church tower. Daniel looked toward the community center where families continued leaving with smiles and conversations. You built something incredible, he said quietly. Ava followed his gaze. No, she answered with a gentle smile. I finally stopped waiting to build it. Daniel nodded. There was nothing left to argue with. Nothing left to defend. Only truth. They stood together watching the sunlight dance across the water. 2 people connected by nearly 2 decades of history. 2 people changed by loss, reflection, and time. Whether their future would lead them back together or continue along separate paths no longer seemed like the most important question. Some stories end with certainty. This one ended with understanding. The afternoon light softened as the sun drifted lower toward the horizon. Families disappeared down the sidewalk. The sounds of the city grew quieter. Ava lifted her coffee and looked out across the harbor. Daniel stood beside her, saying nothing. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind stirred gently. The water reflected gold. And in the peaceful silence between them lived something that had been missing for years. Not control, not obligation, not sacrifice. Respect. The kind that arrives only when people finally learn to see each other clearly. And as the sunlight faded into evening, the silence itself felt like justice.